You've been told steak is the gold standard of American meals, but in 1932, when a ribeye cost what your father made in 3 days, families discovered something corporations spent the next 90 years trying to hide.
Well, the dinner date has begun, and they're all happy about it. They converse pleasantly while Dad serves.
The cheapest cuts, cooked right, tasted better than anything the rich could afford. Walk into a Cleveland kitchen in February 1932 when Mrs. Helen Bartowski bought a 2-pound beef heart for 9 cents at the butcher shop, the organ meat that wealthy families refused to touch because it looked too much like what it was. The sound was the wet thud of the heart hitting her wooden cutting board, and the smell was metallic and clean, like fresh blood mixed with cold air. She'd stuff it with breadcrumbs, onions, and bacon fat, then roast it low and slow for 3 hours until the exterior formed a dark crust and the interior turned tender as pot roast. The texture was dense and meaty, firmer than regular beef, but without the livery funk of kidney or the mineral taste of liver, and when you sliced into it, the juices would run dark red like a medium-rare steak, but richer, almost gamey. Her husband would eat 2 thick slices and declare it better than the Sunday roast they used to afford before the bank closed, and he wasn't lying. Beef heart has more flavor per ounce than sirloin because it's pure muscle that worked every second the animal was alive. By 1945, beef heart prices started climbing as soldiers returning from the war remembered eating it in military mess halls and wanted it again, and by the 1960s, butchers stopped carrying it because the meat industry realized they couldn't charge premium prices for organ meat when customers knew it used to cost 9 cents. Modern nose-to-tail restaurants now serve stuffed beef heart for $38 and call it awful Renaissance cuisine, dandelion, greens with hot bacon dressing. In a Pittsburgh neighborhood in May 1933, when Mr. Stanley Kowalski's weekly wage dropped to $6 and store-bought lettuce cost 12 cents a head, his wife collected dandelion greens from the empty lot 3 blocks over, the bitter, tough leaves that grew wild and free and tasted like the earth they came from. The texture was chewy and fibrous. Nothing like the watery iceberg lettuce rich families bought at the A&P, and she'd boil them for 20 minutes to leach out the bitterness, then drain them and toss them with hot bacon drippings, vinegar, and a spoonful of sugar to balance the bite. The smell was smoky pork fat mixed with sharp vinegar and green vegetable funk, and the taste was complex. Bitter, salty, sour, and slightly sweet all at once, with a mineral aftertaste that reminded you these greens pulled iron straight from the soil. Stanley would sop up the bacon dressing with day-old bread and tell his kids this was how his Polish grandfather ate in the old country, which was half true. The other half was that his grandfather ate dandelions because he was poor, just like Stanley was poor now, and poverty has always tasted the same across generations. By 1950, the USDA started warning against eating roadside plants due to pesticide contamination, and by the 1970s, dandelion greens disappeared from American tables entirely, replaced by bagged salad mix that cost 4 times as much and tasted like wet cardboard. Modern farm-to-table restaurants now serve foraged dandelion salad for $16 and market it as wild seasonal greens. The difference? Stanley Kowalski's 1933 dandelion greens with hot bacon dressing weren't foraged as a lifestyle choice. They were foraged because lettuce was 12 cents and his kids needed vitamins. And they tasted better than any restaurant salad because hunger makes bitter greens taste like survival, and survival tastes like victory when you're still standing after the bank takes everything. Walk into a Milwaukee kitchen in November 1931 when Mrs. Greta Schmidt bought a 10-pound sack of potatoes for 19 cents. The only food she could afford after her husband's factory cut his hours from 60 to 20 per week. She'd grate 6 large potatoes by hand on a metal box grater until her knuckles bled, squeeze out the starchy water through a dish towel, mix in 1 egg, 2 tablespoons of flour, and a pinch of salt, then fry the batter in a cast-iron skillet with a 1/4 inch of lard until the edges turned golden and crispy like lace. The sound was the aggressive sizzle of wet potato batter hitting hot fat, and the smell was starch caramelizing into something that made your stomach growl, even if you'd just eaten. The texture was crispy on the outside, creamy on the inside, with shreds of potato that stayed distinct instead of mashing into paste, and the taste was pure potato flavor, earthy, slightly sweet, with a golden fried richness that made you forget you were eating something that cost 4 cents per serving. Her kids would eat them with applesauce if they had it, sour cream if they were lucky, or plain if they weren't, and they never complained because potato pancakes fried in lard tasted better than the pork chops they used to eat on Sundays before the Depression turned Sundays into just another day of being hungry. By 1955, frozen hash browns appeared in grocery stores, and by the 1970s, boxed potato pancake mix convinced Americans that grating potatoes by hand was too much work, and potato pancakes vanished from non-German households. Modern brunch spots now serve latkes or rösti for $14 with creme fraiche and call it European comfort food. Greta Schmidt's 1931 potato pancakes weren't comfort food. They were proof that potatoes, lard, and thyme could taste better than meat, and they were the reason her family survived winter 1931, when the factory didn't call her husband back to work until March, and by then they'd eaten 180 potato pancakes and lived to tell about it. In a Detroit tenement in January 1934, when Mrs. Dorothy Pierce convinced the butcher to sell her a ham bone with scraps of meat still clinging to it for 7 cents. She brought it home wrapped in brown paper and filled her largest pot with water. The bone, 2 pounds of dried navy beans she'd bought for 16 cents, and nothing else because nothing else fit in the 23-cent budget she had left for the week. The sound was the low simmer of beans, swelling and softening over 6 hours, and the smell was smoky pork and earthy beans filling the apartment so thick the neighbors would knock on her door asking what she was cooking. The texture was creamy, almost pudding-like, as the beans broke down and thickened the broth, and the taste was rich and porky even though there was maybe 2 ounces of actual ham in the entire pot. The bone gave up its marrow, its collagen, and its soul, and by hour 5, the soup tasted like you'd added a pound of meat instead of 7 cents worth of bone. She'd serve it with day-old bread for sopping, and her family of 6 would eat it for 3 days straight. Monday hot, Tuesday reheated, Wednesday cold because the icebox broke, and she couldn't afford to fix it. By the 3rd day, the kids would groan when they saw the pot again, but they'd eat every spoonful because Dorothy Pierce's navy bean soup tasted better than the canned Campbell's soup-rich families bought for 15 cents a can, and everyone at that table knew it. By 1960, instant soup mixes appeared on grocery store shelves, and by the 1980s, bean soup became cultural shorthand for poor people food, and no one admitted that a 7-cent ham bone could produce a soup richer and more complex than anything you'd find in a restaurant. Modern gastropubs now serve white bean and ham hock soup for $18 and call it rustic farmhouse cooking. The difference? Dorothy Pierce's 1934 navy bean soup wasn't rustic. It was what you made when 23 cents had to feed 6 people for 3 days, and it tasted better than anything on a restaurant menu because she cooked it slow enough to extract every molecule of flavor from that bone, and slow cooking is the only luxury poor people can afford. Walk into a rural Georgia kitchen in March 1935 when Mrs. Ruby Mae Johnson boiled water in a cast-iron pot, poured in a cup of cornmeal while stirring constantly to prevent lumps, and cooked it into a thick porridge that looked like wet cement and tasted like corn-flavored paste. She'd pour it into a loaf pan greased with bacon fat. Let it set overnight in the springhouse until it was solid enough to slice with a knife. Then fry the slabs in the morning in a 1/4 inch of bacon drippings until they were golden and crispy on the outside and creamy on the inside. The sound was the sizzle and pop of cornmeal hitting hot fat, and the smell was toasted corn and rendered pork that would make your mouth water before you were fully awake. The texture was crispy like a hash brown on the outside, soft and creamy like polenta on the inside, and the taste was pure corn sweetness with a savory, porky finish that made you forget you were eating something that cost 3 cents per serving. Ruby Mae would serve it with sorghum molasses if they had it, or plain if they didn't, and her husband would eat 4 slices and declare it better than the grits they used to eat before the drought killed half their crops, and they had to sell the mule to pay the bank. By 1950, cornmeal mush disappeared from American breakfast tables, replaced by boxed cereals that cost 10 times as much and had half the nutrition, and by the 1970s, no one under 40 had ever heard of it. Modern Italian restaurants now serve polenta for $16 with braised short ribs and call it Northern Italian comfort food. And no one mentions that it's the exact same fried cornmeal mush that Ruby Mae Johnson made for 3 cents in 1935. The difference? Ruby Mae's 1935 fried cornmeal mush wasn't Italian. It was what you made when cornmeal was the only thing left in the pantry and the chickens weren't laying because it was too cold, and it tasted better than any restaurant polenta because she fried it in bacon fat instead of butter. And bacon fat is the secret ingredient corporations can't bottle because admitting poverty tastes good would destroy their entire business model. These first 5 meals weren't recipes. They were proof that the meat industry lied when they told you steak was king. In 1932, families discovered that a 9-cent beef heart roasted slow-tasted richer than sirloin. That free dandelion greens with bacon dressing had more flavor than store lettuce. That potato pancakes fried in lard beat pork chops. That a 7-cent ham bone made soup better than canned. That fried cornmeal mush tasted like Italian comfort food 90 years before Italy charged you $16 for it. The next 5 meals show you what else they've been hiding. In a Philadelphia row house in August 1933, when Mrs. Agnes Murphy bought a pound of beef liver for 11 cents, 1/5 the price of ground beef, she brought it home in brown butcher paper, already soaking through with blood by the time she reached her kitchen. The smell was metallic and strong, almost overwhelming, and the texture raw was slippery and dense, like a wet sponge made of meat. She'd soak it in milk for an hour to pull out the mineral funk, then dredge it in flour, salt, and pepper, and fry it in bacon grease with sliced onions until the liver was brown and crusty on the outside and still slightly pink in the center. The sound was the aggressive sizzle of liver hitting hot fat and the sweet sigh of onions caramelizing. And the taste was iron-rich and earthy, with a slight bitterness that the sweet onions cut perfectly. Her husband would eat it without complaint, because 11 cents of liver had more iron, more protein, and more vitamins than $1's worth of steak. And when you're working 12-hour shifts in a steel mill, you eat for nutrition, not for Instagram. Her kids hated it, called it punishment food, but they ate it anyway because refusing food in 1933 meant going to bed hungry, and no one chose hungry twice. By 1970, liver and onions became cultural shorthand for disgusting old people food. And by the 1990s, it had vanished from restaurant menus entirely, except in diners where grandmothers still ordered it and waitresses still wrinkled their noses. Modern nutritionists now call liver a superfood and sell desiccated liver capsules for $40 a bottle so you can get the nutrition without tasting it. The difference? Agnes Murphy's 1933 liver and onions wasn't a superfood. It was what you bought when 11 cents was all you had, and your husband needed iron to survive the mill, and it tasted better than steak because she cooked it right. And right means hot pan, bacon grease, and onions so sweet they make you cry. And crying over onions is cheaper than therapy when the world is falling apart. Walk into a Boston tenement in December 1932, when Mrs. Margaret O'Brien saved every slice of stale bread for 2 weeks in a flour sack hanging from a nail on the wall, heels, crusts, and pieces so hard you could use them as hammers, because throwing away food in 1932 was a sin punishable by starvation. She'd tear the bread into chunks, soak them in a mixture of milk, 2 eggs, sugar, cinnamon, and a splash of vanilla she'd been saving for Christmas. Then bake it at 350 degrees until the top formed a golden crust and the inside turned soft and custardy. The smell was cinnamon, vanilla, and caramelized sugar, and the texture was crispy on top, creamy in the middle, with pockets of bread that had soaked up so much custard they burst in your mouth like savory, sweet flavor bombs. The taste was better than cake, richer, more complex, with the slight yeastiness of the bread adding depth that cake could never match, and her kids would fight over the corner pieces where the crust was thickest, and the sugar had caramelized into candy. Margaret would serve it warm with a drizzle of cream if they had it, or plain if they didn't, and either way it tasted like dessert, even though it was made from garbage and cost 17 cents to feed 8 people. By 1955, sliced bread came pre-packaged and stayed soft for weeks thanks to preservatives, and bread pudding became obsolete because no one had stale bread anymore. Modern bakeries now sell artisan bread pudding for $8 a slice and call it elevated comfort food. The difference? Margaret O'Brien's 1932 bread pudding wasn't elevated. It was what you made when throwing away stale bread meant your kids didn't get dessert, and it tasted better than cake because desperation teaches you that stale bread plus eggs plus time equals something worth fighting over, and the last time her family had something worth fighting over was before the bank took the house. In a Birmingham kitchen in July 1934, when Mrs. Evelyn Washington bought 3 pounds of pork neck bones for 19 cents at the colored butcher shop, the bony, gristly cuts that white customers wouldn't touch and the butcher was about to throw away, she brought them home and simmered them low and slow for 6 hours with onions, bay leaves, and black pepper, until the meat fell off the bones and the broth turned thick and gelatinous, with dissolved cartilage and marrow. The sound was the low bubble of bones simmering and the wet snap of tendons separating from vertebrae, and the smell was porky and rich, filling the whole house and making the neighbors jealous, even though they knew exactly what she was cooking because they were cooking it too. She'd serve it over white rice that soaked up the broth like a sponge, and the meat was tender and fatty and tasted like pork shoulder, but more intense, more flavorful, because neck bones worked harder than shoulder, and muscles that work hard taste better. Her husband would suck the marrow out of the bones, and her kids would fight over who got the meatiest vertebrae, and by the end of the meal, the plate would be clean, except for a pile of naked bones that looked like something from an archaeological dig. 19 cents fed a family of 7, and Evelyn Washington's neck bones and rice tasted better than the Sunday pork roast they used to afford before the Depression, and everyone at that table knew it But no one said it out loud because admitting that poverty food tastes better than rich food feels like a betrayal of the American dream. By 1960, neck bones started disappearing from mainstream butcher shops, relegated to soul food markets, and by the 1980s, they'd been gentrified back into grocery stores at $4 a pound and marketed as heritage cuts. Modern soul food restaurants now charge $18 for a plate of neck bones and rice and call it authentic Southern cooking. The difference? Evelyn Washington's 1934 neck bones and rice weren't authentic by design. They were authentic because 19 cents was all she had. And they tasted better than pork roast because she cooked them low enough and slow enough to turn gristle into gelatin and bones into liquid gold. And that kind of alchemy only happens when you have more time than money. Walk into a Cincinnati kitchen in June 1935 when Mr. Harold Schmidt's garden produced more lettuce than his family could eat fresh, and instead of letting it go to waste, his wife poured hot bacon grease and vinegar over the wilting leaves and called it salad. The sound was the sizzle of hot fat hitting cold lettuce, and the smell was smoky bacon and sharp vinegar that made your eyes water if you stood too close. The texture was wilted and soft. Nothing like a fresh salad, but the taste was complex. Bitter lettuce, salty pork fat, sour vinegar, and a touch of sugar to balance it all. And it tasted better than any fresh salad because the hot dressing cooked the lettuce just enough to bring out its sweetness, while the bacon fat made it rich enough to feel like a meal instead of rabbit food. Harold would eat it with a fork and a spoon, sopping up every drop of the dressing with day-old bread, because wasting bacon grease in 1935 was a crime punishable by hunger, and hunger was the judge, jury, and executioner in his neighborhood. In a San Francisco Chinatown apartment in October 1933, when Mrs. Lily Chen bought 2 pounds of chicken feet for 12 cents at the poultry market, the part of the chicken white Americans wouldn't eat because it had toenails and looked like something from a nightmare. She'd boil them for 4 hours until the cartilage softened and the collagen turned the broth into a thick, viscous liquid that jiggled like Jell-O when you spooned it. The smell was chickeny and slightly funky, and the texture was gelatinous and slippery, and you'd gnaw on the feet like corn on the cob, sucking the soft skin and tendons off the tiny bones, and spitting the claws into a bowl. The taste was mild, but the richness of the broth made it feel like you were eating something substantial, even though there was zero meat, just bones, skin, cartilage and collagen, the parts of the animal that hold it together, and the parts that make the best soup, if you know how to cook them. Her kids grew up thinking chicken feet soup was normal, and it wasn't until they went to white friends' houses that they realized most Americans thought eating feet was disgusting, which taught them that disgusting is just another word for you're too rich to understand. By now, you've seen 10 meals that tasted better than steak, and every single one cost less than a quarter. Beef heart for 9 cents, dandelion greens for free, liver for 11 cents, neck bones for 19 cents, chicken feet for 12 cents. The meat industry looked at these meals and realized they had a problem. If Americans figured out that the cheapest cuts taste better when cooked right, no one would ever buy steak again. So they did what corporations always do. They convinced you cheap means bad. The next 10 meals prove they lied. Walk into a Bronx apartment in February 1936 when Mrs. Rosa Martinez bought 3 pounds of oxtail for 28 cents at the butcher, the bony, gelatinous tail cuts that rich customers refused to buy because they looked like dog food, and she simmered them for 8 hours with carrots, potatoes, and onions until the cartilage melted and the broth turned thick and glossy like liquid meat jelly. The sound was the low bubble of bones breaking down, and the wet snap of meat falling off vertebrae, and the smell was so rich and beefy it filled the entire apartment building and made the neighbors knock on her door asking what she was cooking, because oxtail stew smelled like wealth even when it was poverty. The meat would fall off the bone in tender shreds, and the marrow would ooze out like buttery pudding, and you'd suck the bones clean, because wasting marrow in 1936 was a sin her mother had beaten into her in the old country. The taste was richer than pot roast, more complex than brisket, deeper than any steak Rosa had ever eaten back when they could afford steak, and her husband would eat 3 bowls and still scrape the pot for more, because oxtail stew tasted better than anything they used to eat before the Depression taught them that the best parts of the animal are the parts rich people throw away. In a rural Kentucky holler in March 1937, when Mrs. Betty Lou Harper bought a pound of salt pork for 14 cents, the fatty, heavily salted belly meat that was one step above scraps. She'd boil it for an hour to leach out some of the salt, then fry the slices until they were crispy, and use the rendered fat to cook a whole head of cabbage she'd bought for 8 cents. The sound was the sizzle of salt pork crisping, and the wet sigh of cabbage wilting in hot pork fat, and the smell was sweet cabbage and smoky pork that filled the cabin and clung to the walls for days. The texture was crispy pork fat on the outside, tender cabbage that had absorbed all the pork flavor on the inside, and the taste was salty, sweet, and rich, better than bacon because salt pork had more fat, and fat is flavor, and flavor is what makes you forget you're eating something that cost 22 cents total. Her husband would eat 2 plates, and her kids would fight over the crispy pork bits, and Betty Lou would save the leftover cooking fat in a coffee can for the next meal, because nothing got wasted in 1937, not even the memory of pork. Walk into a Newark, New Jersey apartment in November 1934, when Mr. Antonio Russo couldn't afford Parmesan cheese to put on his family's spaghetti, so his wife Maria fried stale breadcrumbs in olive oil with garlic until they were golden and crunchy, and tossed them over the pasta like cheese that had forgotten it was bread. The sound was the crackle of breadcrumbs hitting hot oil, and the rustle of dry crumbs falling over wet noodles, and the smell was toasted garlic and bread that made your mouth water, even though you knew there was no meat, no cheese, no sauce, just pasta, oil, and yesterday's bread repurposed into something that tasted like it cost more than it did. The texture was crunchy crumbs against slippery noodles, and the taste was garlicky and rich with a toasted nuttiness that Parmesan could never match, because breadcrumbs fried in olive oil have a complexity that cheese doesn't. They're crispy, they're savory, and they're made from something you were going to throw away, which makes them taste like victory. Antonio would eat 2 plates and declare it better than the Sunday gravy they used to make with meatballs and sausage before the factory closed, and he wasn't lying to make Maria feel better. He was telling the truth, because fried breadcrumbs with garlic taste better than cheese when you're hungry enough to appreciate the difference between expensive and good. In a Cleveland apartment in August 1932, when Mrs. Helen Kowalski's weekly grocery budget was $1.87, and she had 3 kids who wouldn't stop asking when dinner was ready, she opened a can of tomatoes for 8 cents, boiled half a box of macaroni for 6 cents, and chopped 2 hot dogs into 1/4-inch rounds for 18 cents total, then mixed it all together in a pot and called it Hoover Stew, named after the president everyone blamed for the Depression, because blaming someone made you feel less powerless. The sound was the wet plop of canned tomatoes hitting the pot, and the bubbling of macaroni water boiling over, and the smell was acidic tomato and cheap hot dog meat that filled the apartment with a scent that was more necessity than appetite. The texture was soft macaroni in watery tomato broth, with rubbery hot dog slices that tasted like salt and mystery meat, and the taste was tangy tangy, slightly sweet from the tomatoes, and aggressively salty from the hot dogs, and it tasted better than nothing, which is what they would have eaten if Helen hadn't figured out that 32 cents could feed 5 people if you stopped caring what it looked like. Her kids would eat it without complaint on Monday, tolerate it on Tuesday, and beg for anything else by Wednesday, but they ate every bowl because Hoover stew tasted like survival, and survival tastes better than starvation, even when it's named after a president you hate. Walk into a Dayton, Ohio kitchen in June 1935 when Mrs. Linda Hayes couldn't afford hamburger or pork chops, so she bought a 1-pound chub of bologna for 29 cents and fried thick slices in a dry pan until the edges curled up like bowls and the center blistered and popped, then brushed them with ketchup and let it caramelize into a sticky glaze that tasted like fake smoke and sugar. The sound was the sizzle and pop of bologna fat rendering and the wet hiss of ketchup hitting hot meat, and the smell was processed meat and burnt tomato paste that would soak into the kitchen wallpaper for 3 days. The texture was crispy on the edges, spongy in the middle, with a snap when you bit through the caramelized ketchup crust, and the taste was salty, sweet, and smoky, in a way that made you forget you were eating the cheapest meat in the butcher case. Her kids would eat it on white bread with nothing else, because bologna and ketchup didn't need anything else. It was complete, self-contained, perfect in its simplicity, and it tasted better than the Sunday pot roast they used to have before her husband's hours got cut, because bologna and ketchup didn't need anything else. It was complete, self-contained, perfect in its simplicity, and it tasted better than the Sunday pot roast they used to have before her husband's hours got cut, and Sunday became just another day of being poor. Kitchen in January 1938, when Mrs. Ruby Lee Jackson bought 4 pig's feet for 22 cents at the colored butcher shop. The part of the pig that white customers wouldn't touch, because it had toenails and looked like something you'd find in a nightmare. She'd scrub them under cold running water for 10 minutes to get the slaughter smell out, then simmer them for 6 hours in water, vinegar, bay leaves, and black pepper until the skin turned translucent and the tendons dissolved into gelatin and the bones fell out when you picked them up. The sound was the low bubble of pig's feet breaking down, and the wet snap of cartilage separating from bone, and the smell was pork and vinegar and something funky that you either loved or hated, depending on whether your grandmother made you eat them as a child. The texture was gelatinous skin over tender meat over soft cartilage, and you'd eat them with your hands, gnawing around the bones and sucking the marrow out like you were excavating a delicious archaeological site. The taste was rich and porky, with a vinegar tang that cut the fattiness, and it tasted better than pork chops, because pig's feet had more flavor per ounce than any other part of the pig. They'd walked through mud, carried weight, worked harder than ribs or loin, and muscles that work hard taste better. Walk into a Minneapolis kitchen in October 1933 when Mrs. Ingrid Larson couldn't afford enough ground beef to make meatloaf, so she stretched half a pound of beef with 2 cups of oats, 1 egg, and diced onions, forming it into a loaf that was more grain than meat, but tasted like her Norwegian grandmother's recipe if you didn't think too hard about the ratio. The sound was the wet squish of oats absorbing moisture and binding with the meat, and the smell, once it started baking, was beefy and earthy and made your stomach growl, even though you knew there was more oatmeal than beef in that pan. The texture was dense and hearty, more like a savory oat cake than traditional meatloaf, and the taste was beefy enough to satisfy, even though half a pound of beef divided among 6 people meant each slice had maybe an ounce of actual meat. Her husband would eat 2 slices, and her kids would smother it in ketchup to hide the oat texture, but everyone cleaned their plates because Depression meatloaf tasted better than no meatloaf, and better than nothing was the highest compliment you could give food in 1933. By 1955, meatloaf recipes went back to being mostly meat, and by the 1970s, oat-based meatloaf became a punchline in sitcoms about poor people, and no one admitted that oats made the meatloaf hold together better, stay moister longer, and stretch further than any all-beef version ever could. Modern health food bloggers now make oat-based meatloaf and call it plant-forward comfort food, and charge you $12 for the recipe. In a rural Indiana farmhouse in February 1936, when Mrs. Clara Whitman's pantry was down to a 10-pound sack of potatoes and a smoked ham hock her husband had bartered for with a dozen eggs, she filled her largest pot with water, dropped in the hock, and simmered it for 4 hours until the kitchen smelled like a smokehouse and the meat fell off the bone in salty, fatty shreds. She'd peel and dice the potatoes, add them to the pot with the ham hock broth, and cook them until they started to break down and thicken the soup into something that was more stew than broth, more meal than side dish. The sound was the low simmer of potatoes dissolving and the wet snap of ham hock meat separating from bone, and the smell was smoky pork and earthy potato, and made you forget that there were only 2 ingredients in the entire pot. The texture was creamy and chunky at the same time, with some potatoes holding their shape and others disintegrating into the broth to create a thick, velvety base, and the taste was smoky, salty, and starchy, simple but complete, like a 3-chord song that doesn't need a fourth. Her family of 6 would eat it for 2 days straight, Monday hot, Tuesday reheated, and by Tuesday night her husband would scrape the pot and declare it better than the ham dinners they used to have on Easter before the drought killed half the crops. By 1960, potato soup became associated with bland white people food, and by the 1980s, it had disappeared from restaurant menus entirely except in German restaurants where they charged $14 and called it Kartoffelsuppe. Walk into a Georgia kitchen in July 1934 when Mrs. May Johnson baked a pan of cornbread for 11 cents. Cornmeal, buttermilk, baking soda, salt, and served it in bowls with cold buttermilk poured over it like cereal, a meal that looked like prison food but tasted like summer in the South. The sound was the crumble of cornbread breaking apart in the bowl and the glug of buttermilk covering it, and the smell was toasted corn and tangy buttermilk that made your mouth pucker before you even took a bite. The texture was crumbly cornbread that soaked up the buttermilk and turned soft and creamy, and the taste was sweet corn and sour buttermilk and salt. And it tasted better than cake because cornbread made with buttermilk has a complexity that cake made with regular milk will never achieve. The acid in the buttermilk reacts with the baking soda to create a tender crumb and a tangy flavor that makes you want another bite even when you're full. Her kids would eat it for breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner when there was nothing else, and they never complained because cornbread and buttermilk tasted like Georgia in July, and Georgia in July tastes like home, even when home is a sharecropper's shack with no electricity and a dirt floor. By 1950, cornbread and buttermilk disappeared from Southern tables, replaced by cereal and milk that cost 3 times as much and had half the nutrition, and by the 1970s, no one under 40 had ever heard of eating cornbread in buttermilk unless their grandmother was still alive to remember it. Modern Southern restaurants don't serve cornbread and buttermilk because it doesn't photograph well and city people think it looks like dog food, but they're wrong. May Johnson's 1934 cornbread and buttermilk tasted better than any brunch you've ever eaten because buttermilk in 1934 was real buttermilk. In a Chicago tenement in March 1937, when Mrs. Catherine O'Brien bought a 3-pound beef shank for 34 cents, the bony, sinewy cut that rich families fed to their dogs, she brought it home and simmered it for 10 hours with onions, carrots, and celery until the connective tissue dissolved and the broth turned thick and gelatinous, and the meat fell off the bone like it was apologizing for being so tough at the start. The sound was the low simmer of bones giving up their marrow and the wet snap of tendons separating from the shank bone. And the smell was so rich and beefy, it made the entire tenement building smell like a steakhouse, even though no one in that building could afford steak. The texture was fall-apart tender meat in a broth so thick it coated your spoon, and the taste was richer than any steak Catherine had ever eaten, deeper, more complex, with layers of flavor that came from 10 hours of bones breaking down and releasing their secrets into the water. She'd serve it over egg noodles to stretch it further, and her family of 7 would eat it for 2 days and still scrape the pot clean on the 3rd day because beef shank soup tasted better than Sunday roast, and everyone at that table knew it, but no one said it out loud, because admitting that 34-cent soup tastes better than $2 roast feels like admitting you've been wasting money your whole life. Walk into a Memphis kitchen in September 1935 when Mr. Charles Davis bought 2 pounds of chicken gizzards for 23 cents at the butcher shop, the muscular organ meat that white customers wouldn't buy because it required work to chew and didn't look like food. And his wife Evelyn would flour them heavy with salt and pepper and fry them in a cast-iron skillet with lard until they were golden and crispy on the outside and chewy on the inside. The sound was the aggressive sizzle of gizzards hitting hot fat and the crackle of the breading crisping up, and the smell was fried chicken times 10 because gizzards have more flavor per ounce than breast or thigh. They're pure muscle that worked every second the chicken was alive, grinding grain and grit, and muscles that work hard taste better. The texture was crunchy breading giving way to dense, chewy meat that you had to work for, and the taste was chickeny and rich and slightly gamey in a way that made you understand that chicken used to be a wild bird before corporations domesticated the flavor out of it. Her kids would eat them like popcorn, and her husband would declare them better than fried chicken breast. And he wasn't wrong. Gizzards have more flavor, more texture, more character than any breast ever will. In a Charleston, South Carolina, kitchen on New Year's Day, 1933, when Mrs. Sarah Jenkins cooked a pot of Hopping John, black-eyed peas, rice, and a ham hock, because eating it on New Year's was supposed to bring good luck, and in 1933, her family needed every bit of luck they could get. The sound was the low simmer of peas, softening and rice swelling, and the smell was smoky ham and earthy peas that filled the house and made you believe that maybe, just maybe, this year would be better than the last. The texture was creamy peas and fluffy rice with shreds of smoky ham mixed throughout, and the taste was savory, slightly sweet from the peas, and rich with the ham fat that had rendered into the cooking liquid. Her family of 8 would eat it for 3 meals: New Year's lunch, dinner, and January 2nd breakfast. And by the 3rd meal, they'd still be scraping the pot, because Hopping John tasted better the longer it sat, better the more the flavors married, better than any meal they'd eaten all year. The meal cost 41 cents, dried black-eyed peas for 12 cents, rice for 18 cents, ham hock for 11 cents, and it fed 8 people for 3 meals, which meant each meal cost less than 2 cents per person, which meant Hopping John wasn't just lucky, it was mathematical proof that you could survive on pocket change if you knew how to cook. Walk into a rural Tennessee farmhouse in April 1936 when Mrs. Dolly Mae Watson made breakfast gravy from nothing but flour, milk, bacon grease, salt, and pepper. No sausage, no meat, just the ghost of bacon past living in the fat she'd saved in a coffee can. The sound was the hiss of flour hitting hot grease and the scrape of a wooden spoon stirring constantly to prevent lumps. And the smell was toasted flour and bacon memories that made your mouth water even though there was no meat in the pan. The texture was thick and creamy, coating the back of a spoon like velvet, and the taste was rich and savory and porky, even though the only pork in it was the fat, and fat carries flavor better than meat ever could. She'd pour it over biscuits she'd made from flour, lard, and buttermilk, and her family of 6 would eat 4 biscuits each and sop up every drop of gravy with the last biscuit, because wasting milk gravy was a sin punishable by hunger. The whole breakfast cost 29 cents. Flour for the biscuits and gravy, milk, bacon grease from last week's bacon, and it tasted better than the sausage gravy they used to make on Sundays before the farm prices collapsed, and they had to sell half the pigs just to pay the bank. In a rural Ohio farmhouse in November 1934, when Mr. Frank Muller trapped a wild rabbit in his field and brought it home for dinner because they hadn't eaten meat in 6 days, his wife Anna would skin it, cut it into pieces, and stew it low and slow with potatoes, carrots, onions, and turnips until the meat fell off the bone and the vegetables dissolved into a thick, hearty stew that tasted like Thanksgiving, even though it was Tuesday. The sound was the wet snap of rabbit bones breaking and the low simmer of root vegetables turning to mush, and the smell was gamey meat and earthy vegetables and filled the farmhouse with a scent that made you forget they were eating something Frank caught in a wire trap instead of something they bought at the butcher shop. The texture was tender rabbit meat that tasted like dark meat chicken, but wilder, gamier, more interesting, and the root vegetables were so soft they melted in your mouth like vegetable pudding. The taste was rich and savory, with a slight gamey funk that the root vegetables balanced perfectly, and it tasted better than chicken stew because rabbit has more flavor and root vegetables cost nothing when you grow them yourself. Anna would serve it with biscuits for sopping, and Frank would eat 3 bowls and declare it better than the beef stew they used to make before the Depression, and he wasn't being kind, he was telling the truth, because rabbit stew made with vegetables you grew and meat you trapped tastes better than anything you can buy, because it's yours, and yours tastes better than store-bought, and store-bought is what rich people eat when they don't know how to trap, grow, or wait. By 1950, rabbit hunting became a redneck hobby instead of a survival strategy, and by the 1980s, rabbit had disappeared from American dinner tables entirely. Modern farm-to-table restaurants now serve wild rabbit stew for $48 and call it game cuisine. In a Detroit apartment in May 1938, when Mrs. Helen Kowalski's grocery budget was down to 83 cents for the week, and she had 2 kids who needed breakfast before school, she fried thick slices of bologna in a dry pan until the edges curled up and got crispy, then cracked 2 eggs into the same pan and let them fry in the bologna fat until the whites were crispy and lacy and the yolks were still runny. The sound was the sizzle and pop of bologna fat rendering and eggs frying, and the smell was salty processed meat and rich egg yolk that made you forget you were eating the cheapest breakfast possible. The texture was crispy bologna edges, spongy center, crispy egg whites, and a yolk that broke and ran into everything when you cut into it. The taste was salty, rich, and satisfying in a way that made you understand why poor people never go hungry if they know how to cook. Her kids would eat it with white bread for sopping the yolk and bologna fat, and they'd go to school full and happy even though breakfast cost 14 cents total. And 14 cents is proof that you can feed a family on pocket change if you're willing to eat bologna and call it good. By 1970, fried bologna and eggs became a marker of poverty that no middle-class family would admit to eating. And by the 1990s, it had disappeared entirely from American breakfast tables. Modern brunch spots don't serve fried bologna and eggs because it doesn't Instagram well, and customers expect bacon. Walk into a rural Alabama kitchen in August 1932 when Mrs. Hattie Mae Williams had a bumper crop of tomatoes from her garden and nothing else to eat, so she made gravy from stewed tomatoes, flour, bacon grease, salt, and pepper, and poured it over white rice like it was Sunday dinner even though it was Wednesday and they hadn't seen meat since last Friday. The sound was the hiss of flour hitting hot bacon grease, and the wet plop of tomatoes hitting the pan, and the smell was acidic tomato and smoky bacon fat that made your mouth water even though you knew there was no meat in that gravy. The texture was thick and smooth with chunks of tomato that had broken down but not disappeared, and the taste was tangy, slightly sweet, and rich with bacon fat that made the tomatoes taste like they were something more than just tomatoes. Her family of 7 would eat it over rice and scrape the pot clean because tomato gravy over rice tasted better than the chicken and rice they used to eat on Sundays before the drought killed the chickens and the bank took the land. By 1955, tomato gravy disappeared from Southern kitchens, replaced by red sauce and marinara that came in jars and cost 3 times as much, and by the 1980s, no one remembered that tomato gravy over rice used to be a meal instead of just a side dish. Modern Southern restaurants don't serve tomato gravy because it sounds too simple, and customers expect complexity. Pittsburgh tenement in December 1937, when Mr. Stanley Novak's unemployment check was late and his wife had 37 cents in her purse. She opened a can of pork and beans for 9 cents and fried thick slices of day-old bread in bacon grease until they were golden and crispy, and that was dinner for 4 people. The sound was the wet plop of beans hitting a pot and the crackle of bread frying, and the smell was sweet beans and toasted bread and made you forget you were eating something that cost 21 cents total. The texture was creamy beans over crispy fried bread that soaked up the sauce and turned soft in the middle while staying crunchy on the edges, and the taste was sweet, savory, and rich with bacon fat that made cheap beans taste like something you'd order at a restaurant if restaurants served Depression food. Her kids would eat 2 slices each, and her husband would declare it better than the bean soup they used to make before the factory closed, and he wasn't lying. Pork and beans over fried bread tasted better than bean soup because fried bread is always better than plain bread, and bacon grease is always better than nothing. And nothing was what they'd have if Stanley's unemployment check didn't arrive by Friday. By 1960, pork and beans became associated with bachelor food and camping food. And by the 1980s, no family would admit to serving it for dinner because it was too simple and too cheap, and admitting you ate canned beans for dinner meant admitting you were poor. Walk into a Philadelphia kitchen in January 1935 when Mrs. Dorothy Schmidt's husband brought home pork scraps from the slaughterhouse, the bits of meat, fat, and organs that didn't fit anywhere else, and she boiled them with cornmeal and spices until they formed a thick loaf that looked like meat-flavored cement and tasted like every part of the pig that rich people threw away. The sound was the low simmer of pork scraps breaking down and the wet slap of the mixture being poured into a loaf pan, and the smell was porky and earthy and would soak into the kitchen walls for days. She'd let it cool overnight until it was solid enough to slice, then fry the slices in a hot pan until they were crispy on the outside and creamy on the inside. The texture was crunchy crust giving way to soft, porky interior, and the taste was rich and complex because scrapple is made from every part of the pig: liver, heart, snout, ears, fat, and every part tastes different, and different tastes better than uniform, and uniform is what you get when you buy store-bought sausage that's been homogenized into boring. Her husband would eat 3 slices with eggs and declare it better than bacon, and he was telling the truth because scrapple has more flavor than bacon. Bacon is just fat and meat, but scrapple is fat, meat, organs, and cornmeal absorbs flavor like a sponge, and when you fry it crispy, it tastes like the best part of every pork product combined into one. By 1960, scrapple became regionally limited to Pennsylvania and Delaware, and by the 1980s, it had disappeared from national grocery stores because Americans decided that eating pig scraps was gross, even though pig scraps taste better than the cuts they replaced them with. Buttermilk biscuits with honey. In a rural Kentucky farmhouse in June 1933, when Mrs. Betty Sue Harper made buttermilk biscuits from flour, lard, buttermilk, and baking soda, 4 ingredients, 23 cents total, and served them with honey her husband had bartered for with a bushel of corn, and that was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner when there was nothing else. The sound was the scrape of a wooden spoon mixing dough and the thud of biscuits being cut out with an old tin can, and the smell once they hit the oven was butter and yeast, and made you forget there was no butter or yeast in the recipe. Just lard and buttermilk doing an impression so good it fooled your nose. The texture was flaky on the outside, tender on the inside, and the taste was buttery, even though it was lard, and rich, even though it was simple. And when you drizzled honey over a hot biscuit, the honey would melt into the layers and turn every bite into a sweet, buttery miracle that tasted better than cake. Her kids would eat 4 biscuits each and still ask for more because buttermilk biscuits with honey tasted better than the Sunday breakfast they used to have before the farm prices collapsed. Walk into a rural Iowa kitchen in November 1932 when Mrs. Dorothy Bennett stood at her Formica counter staring at an empty refrigerator and a Depression-era cookbook her mother had pressed into her hands 2 years earlier with the warning, "You'll need this someday." That day was Thanksgiving 1932, when ground beef cost $2 a pound, eggs were 79 cents a dozen, and her grocery budget was $1.63 for a family of 5. She was making a Thanksgiving pie with no apples, no pumpkin, no eggs, and no milk. Just 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of butter, and 2 cups of cold tap water mixed into a filling that looked like wallpaper paste and poured like joint compound. The sound was the scrape of a wooden spoon against a chipped mixing bowl, and the smell, once it hit the oven, was butter browning and sugar caramelizing into something that made your mouth water, even though your brain knew it was a lie. It baked at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, and what came out resembled custard if you squinted and didn't ask questions, a wobbly, translucent filling that jiggled when you cut into it and oozed a thin, syrupy liquid that pooled on the plate like melted jello. The texture was gelatinous and slippery, somewhere between flan and wallpaper paste, and the taste was sweet and starchy with a weird, chalky aftertaste that came from the flour not fully dissolving into the water. But if you closed your eyes, held your breath, and wanted desperately to believe it was a real pie, your brain would cooperate just enough to make you grateful. Her kids each had a slice and said "thank you" in voices that sounded like they were at a funeral, because gratitude is mandatory when your mother is performing miracles with a cup of flour and 2 cups of tap water. Her husband took 2 bites, paused, then took a third, and said it was fine, which in 1932 Iowa was the highest compliment you could give a pie made from nothing. The recipe came from a 1918 cookbook titled Make Do and Mend, and Dorothy's mother had handed it to her in 1930 with the inscription, "For when times get hard again." Dorothy had never opened it until October 1932, when the Depression turned hard times from a grandparent's memory into a daily reality. By 1945, the recipe disappeared from cookbooks entirely because admitting that American families were baking pies made of sugar water was bad for national morale when the country was supposed to be celebrating victory, not remembering poverty. These 30 meals weren't recipes. They were evidence that American families survived the Depression by discovering something corporations spent the next 90 years trying to make you forget. The cheapest cuts, cooked right, taste better than anything you can buy today. From 1929 to 1939, when grocery prices doubled and wages were cut in half, families started cooking the parts of animals that rich people threw away: beef heart, pig's feet, chicken gizzards, oxtail, neck bones, and they discovered that those cuts had more flavor, more richness, more soul than sirloin or pork chops ever could. They learned that dandelion greens taste better than iceberg lettuce, that potato pancakes beat pork chops, that salt pork is fattier than bacon, that breadcrumb pasta tastes better than Parmesan, that you can make dessert from tap water if you're desperate enough. The meat industry looked at these meals and realized they had a crisis. If Americans figured out that 9-cent beef heart tastes better than $2 steak, the entire premium beef market would collapse. If they realized that free dandelion greens have more vitamins than 49-cent lettuce, grocery stores would lose half their produce revenue. If they figured out that 23-cent chicken gizzards taste better than 89-cent chicken breast, the poultry industry would have to admit that they've been selling you the wrong part of the chicken for 90 years. So they did what corporations always do. They convinced you that cheap means bad, that organ meats are disgusting, that foraging is dangerous, that poverty food tastes poor. They created the USDA grading system to make you believe that prime and choice mean better instead of just more expensive. They marketed bacon as premium and salt pork as poverty. They turned oxtail into luxury peasant food and charged you $40 for the same cut that cost 28 cents in 1936.